Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 407. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, the author series. In this special series, I work with publishers and authors in the mental health field to bring you the books that are making a difference on such topics as trauma, addiction, and mindfulness. In this series, we'll talk with the authors and explore how these books can help you, the therapists and clinicians who are making a difference in this incredible field. Let's get started. All right, folks, before we get started, PESI and my guests today, Drs. Leslie Sokol and Marci G. offering Trauma Therapist Podcast listeners 20% off Leslie and Marci's new book, The Comprehensive Clinician's Guide to Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. This book is written for mental health professionals with all levels of experience, students, trainers, supervisors, teachers, brimming with practical and easy to understand tools to help you put CBT theory into practice. The book's filled with worksheets, coping cards, step-by-step plans, and activities that make it really accessible to help you teach your clients effective coping skills, which builds their confidence and eliminates self-doubt, which is the most crucial part of treatment. I can tell you that in preparation for this interview, I went through the book and read a lot of these worksheets and step-by-step plans as from the client's point of view, having experienced trauma myself. And I can tell you these worksheets were really empowering for me. And I'm sure if you're looking to work with individuals and especially work with trauma, this workbook is going to be invaluable. So head on over to PESI.com/CBT guide. That's PESI.com/CBT guide and use the discount code TTP20. That's TTP20. All right. All right, guys, welcome back to the author series. I am super excited to have as my guests today, Leslie Sokol and Marci Fox. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
All right. So in this author series today, we're going to be talking about the book, The Comprehensive Clinician's Guide to Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. I want to welcome you both. We'll get into introductions, and let's just do that right now. So Leslie Sokol is a licensed psychologist and an internationally recognized leader in the field of cognitive behavioral therapy with more than 35 years of experience in practice, teaching, and research. She was past director of education and one of the principal instructors at the internationally acclaimed Beck Institute for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy in Philadelphia. Leslie has taught cognitive therapy to professional and paraprofessional groups, both nationally and internationally, on a multitude of CBT topics, and is a distinguished founding fellow of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy and a past president. Marci Fox is a licensed psychologist also. She's been in private practice for over 25 years and specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy with teens and adults. She's worked with the Beck Institute for Cognitive Behavior Therapy in Philadelphia for almost the same amount of time. As an Academy of Cognitive Therapy certified trainer consultant and adjunct faculty member at the Beck Institute, Marci trains individuals in cognitive therapy both nationally and internationally. All right, ladies, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So before we dive in here, just quickly share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're calling from, and then we'll get going here. So Marci, why don't you start off?
Well, I grew up in New Jersey, and I did a lot of training in Philadelphia, first at the Center for Cognitive Therapy at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I moved over to the Beck Institute for Cognitive Behavior Therapy, where I met Leslie, who was the director of education there. And about 15 years ago, I got tired of the cold and moved down to Boca Raton, Florida, where I have a private practice.
Nice. All right.
And I'm a lifelong Philly girl. I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs. I practice in the Philadelphia suburbs. I did my PhDs at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And I had a 20-some year appointment also at a local hospital teaching behavioral science here in the Philadelphia suburbs. And till this day, I still maintain private practice in a family doc's office here in the Philadelphia suburbs.
Where in Philly? Because I used to live in Philly.
So now we live in Gwinnett Valley, and my practice is in Lansdale. So really in the northern suburbs.
Nice. All right. So as I was kind of explaining to, I think, Marci before we started recording here, what my goal here is to not just bring books to my listeners, put them on the podcast, but to dial in, drill down, and talk about how and why these books are useful and helpful to our listeners. So let's start talking about this book here. First, why did you write this book, and who is it for?
Well, first of all, I want to say that this book is, I feel, putting our voice in the universe. I mean, this is like I wrote this book and I can sit back and relax. I am a true believer of CBT, as is Marci, but I'm a believer because not only do I read the research and not only did I do the research, but I treated clients myself. And, as a very young student out of graduate school, recruited to do my internship with Dr. Beck, I, was like, okay, fine, I'm a number cruncher. It's just more numbers I'm going to crunch. And then I saw clients, because I was forced to, not because I really thought I was going to be doing that. And the power of this model was overwhelming. I mean, I just couldn't believe how lives were changed. And, the more proficient and expert I got at delivering the model, the more I participated in trials validating what I was delivering, the more excited I got about disseminating this theory so that everybody could have less distress in their lives, so that therapists had the tools to give to individuals so that they could have less distress and be more functional. And I have really spent the majority of my professional career disseminating CBT. And after 30 some years of doing this, I found a way to teach this that audiences really seem to understand and digest. And supervisees that Marci and I supervise, and we supervise hundreds, maybe over 1,000 supervisees, have really brought up their proficiency and brought up their skills. And finally, the two of us said, it's time to put this in print so that, people can really see this is the model, this is how you use the model, this is specifically the tools that you can use to implement the model. And, that way we could disseminate and share it with even more people that we can have direct access to.
Well, let's talk about the model. When you said the power of this model, part of me wanted to ask you, well, talk about the power. What is the power? And let's talk about that by talking about for our audience. And I know we can go on forever about this, but give us a brief overview of what CBT is and why and how you feel it's so powerful.
Well, the cognitive model is situations don't cause you to feel a certain way. It's really your interpretation or your perception of a situation that causes you to feel a certain way, have your body respond a certain way, have you behave a certain way, and it even impacts your motivation. So by pulling out your thinking, you can make significant changes in all those other areas. And then help people not only to be able to take a step back and say, just because I think it or feel it doesn't mean it's true, let me check it out. But you can then help them to be in better control to retrain their brain. The next piece is helping them to figure out more effective behaviors that they can use. Because a lot of people fall into the pattern of using the same behaviors over and over and over again. And it also helps people to understand that when they go into situations, there's not, their feelings don't just have to take over. And so it gives them a better sense of control of who they are. And
so
go ahead.
What you're saying here, the first thing that's coming up to my mind is that you're talking about a lot of things that we do automatically, and you're saying, well, wait a minute, CBT is allowing, is giving the opportunity to kind of slow down and kind of dissect and look at each of those things. Because, as you were talking, I was thinking back to my own experience of being bullied and how just things, automatically things happen, beliefs, feelings happen.
Sure.
Behaviors, yeah.
So we have lots and lots of thoughts that go through our minds at any given time. Lots of times because we've never been taught to think about our thinking, we just buy into it. And now we're working with folks to take a step back so they can pull out their thought, identify it, and examine it. And teaching people that rather than being reactive, they can be more effective. And underneath all those automatic thoughts that they're having is doubt. And doubt is that nasty label or that monster that sits on your shoulder calling you nasty names. And by pulling out the doubt, you can start to recognize that there's lots of themes in your thinking. And so over time, we teach people to pull out that doubt into the light so they can question it, examine it, chip away at it, and eventually eradicate it and replace it with confidence so that that person has a new, positive, accurate, realistic belief or understanding of who they are now.
But I want to say that you asked specifically, what is the power in CBT? And if we think about Beckian CBT specifically, the power in CBT is at the cognitive level. What predicts change? It's change in cognition. And as Marci's saying, cognition can happen at a situation-specific level. And if we blindly accept our thoughts, we're going to let erroneous or distorted or dysfunctional thinking, lead us to feel all kinds of unpleasant emotions and physiological sensations that aren't warranted. And at a deeper level, we have assumptions that we operate under. And at an even deeper level, we have pervasive beliefs that really shape the way we see any given situation. The power in CBT is modifying those perceptions into more accurate, but not just accurate, into the most accurate, positive perspective possible. But listen, we're not just about thinking, we're also about doing. Doing validates cognitive change. I mean, proof is in the pudding, right? You can't just talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. So walking the walk is what provides the data to solidify that cognitive change. And sometimes cognitive change can't take place until you run the behavioral experiment and you find out once and for all, is my hypothesis valid or not? And as we talk about trauma specifically, think about what is trauma? A fear of something. In PTSD, it's a fear of reliving the trauma. In panic, it's a fear of bodily sensations. And what is the power in behavioral exposure is to test your fear hypothesis so your brain can come to a new conclusion. And the problem with treatment is people don't want to face what's unpleasant for them. And avoidance is really the biggest problem in recovery.
Okay. Man, there's so much here. Before we kind of go down and get more specific about how that might be applicable, how all of this might be applicable to trauma, I do want to say that one of the things that really stood out to me in about this book was the way it's laid out. It's very user friendly in a way. I was reading through this. I think I was talking to Marci before we started recording, and I was reading through some of the worksheets, of which there are many, and they're, I think, beautifully laid out. I was going through some of the worksheets myself for my own benefit, and there was something very empowering about, wait a minute, yeah, that's true, and that's true about me, and oh God, that's true about me too. I don't want to admit that. How am I going to be, what are people going to think about me if I talk about that? But finding that out, discovering that, I found, as if I put myself in the role of a client, very empowering. And if I put myself in the role of a therapist, there's a lot of power in that. What do you say to that?
There's a power in having an internal roadmap so that you are able to conceptualize who you are. And you recognize how past experiences and traumas and upsets all play a role in developing how you think about yourself and the belief you have at the core. And you start to recognize that you may be operating with these if-then assumptions. And for example, if I get to know someone, then I'm vulnerable. And so the flip side would be, so your core belief would be activated, your doubt would be activated. And so the flip side of that is, if I keep myself protected or if I avoid others, then people won't find me vulnerable. Then I don't make myself vulnerable.
But Marci's giving you the specifics, but in the more general model, you're really raising questions that really address the core of CBT. You know, CBT is based on a psychological model. It's not a medical model. We're not here to cure you. We're here to teach you how to more effectively cope. If you're going to cope, you got to learn to be your own therapist. And that it empowers individuals. But you talk about something I think even more profound. And that is one of the basic principles of CBT. In fact, probably what differentiated it from the beginning from REBT was the principle of guided discovery. You know, Beck had this idea that telling people, you know, the reality of a situation, it's why when a panic person shows up into an ER and a doctor says you're not dying, they don't believe them. But when you take a panic client and you bring them into our office and we do an interceptive experiment of overbreathing and you show them that you can bring on the symptoms and you're not going to die, it becomes believable. That's the process of guided discovery, guiding the person through either cognitive conversations or through behavioral experiments to see the data so the light bulb switches in their own head and they say, I get it. And that's why, particularly in the treatment of panic, which by the way was my baby, is why I think that's where CBT is most powerful, because you do one behavioral experiment and the person says, oh my God, this makes total sense. I have been suffering with this all these years because I've been afraid of something that isn't dangerous.
And now I have a new accurate conclusion about it.
Let's walk through what that interoceptive experience might look like, and then from there, let's kind of walk into talking more about PTSD and applications. So, go back to that interoceptive experience with panic. What would that look like when someone comes into your office?
And let me just tell you one other thing about interoceptive experience, that it's an exposure that has been validated in the treatment of panic disorder, but it is an experiment that should be used across diagnoses, and I do it a lot in substance abuse, and you need to use it across diagnoses because it is one of the most effective exposures to alleviate persons' fear hypothesis that anxiety is dangerous. So someone walks into your office and you ask them, how anxious are you? 0 to 10. You know, all right, if they're an anxiety disorder, they're not going to be 0. They're going to be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe they're a 10. They're in acute anxiety sitting in your office. You ask them, if it's a panic client, you ask them, can you remember your last panic experience? What are the symptoms you typically experience, regardless of the anxiety diagnosis? Tell me the symptoms you typically experience when you get anxious. And then what you do is you say, you know, I'm going to do a little experiment with you to see what goes on when you get anxious and for us to figure out a game plan to help you address this fear. Are you in? Notice I'm not being completely honest. I'm not saying I'm going to try and produce the most unpleasant experience of anxiety you've ever had, but we don't tell them that. And so what I do is I do the interoceptive exposure. There are many different kinds of interoceptive exposures, and you can combine them. The most commonly used one is overbreathing, because overbreathing tends to simulate the symptoms that most people are afraid of. You get dizzy, you get sweaty, you get tingling, you feel uncomfortable. But you can run in place, you can spin yourself in circles. If your discomfort is of chest discomfort, take a deep breath, hold it. If you get a sense of suffocating, an interoceptive exposure would be to pinch your nose, grab one of those little stir straws, not one with a flat opening, one with a square opening. Try to breathe through one of those. You'll get lots of claustrophobia. And the over breathing would be, and we used to do it for 2. We only need to do it for 1 because we just want to produce those symptomatology. And so I would say to someone, breathe along with me. Let's go. Right? And we do that for about a minute. Big, deep breathing. We're cheerleading them on. Come on, just give me a couple more. And if they want to quit, always push them to do a couple more breaths than they think they can do. You're testing a fear hypothesis. Then in their height of their arousal, you ask them, how anxious are you now? 100% they're going to be more anxious than they were when they walked into your office, or they don't have an anxiety issue. And you're going to ask them, what thoughts are running through your mind? I'm going to faint. I'm going to have a heart attack. I'm going to puke. What are they thinking? And then you can ask them, what's your worst fear? They might have it. They might not. You sit them back down. You have them close their mouth. And you have them take a couple of slow breaths through their nose. Guess what's going to happen? All the arousal is going to disappear. What do you make of that? And then remember, now they might say, well, I can control this. Well, that's not what we're trying to learn. The fact that you can control it says, could it be medically dangerous? Could you stop a heart attack by shutting your mouth? Could you stop a stroke? You thought you were going to faint, and I always make them stand up and not hold on to anything to prove you thought you were going to faint. Did you faint? In fact, I didn't let you hold on, because if you hold on, that's a safety mechanism. That's interrupting the experiment, because if I hadn't held on, I would have passed out. Well, so let's not hold on. And, there's a great video of Dr. Beck himself over-breathing a really anxious client, and he stands up with her, and, he's a little bit aged, and he's like, go ahead, if you're going to fall, I'm going to catch you. So, that's how much we know that the fear is erroneous.
Right. Wow. I was going through that myself when you were.
And the great piece there is that you can either do nothing, which is, talk to them about how their weekend was, or ask them if they've read any of your books on the shelf, or count how many E's you have maybe in some of your diplomas, and then ask them how they're feeling. And they start to recognize that by doing nothing, their anxiety is still going away. Mm-hmm. And so you're helping them to draw the new conclusion. Anxiety is uncomfortable, but it's not dangerous. And if you really want to make your point, you can say, so did you die in my office? Did you have a heart attack in my office? And then sometimes they say, oh, okay, so all those other times I felt it must have just been anxiety. And you really want to be collecting the data when they went to the doctors, what the feedback was, so that you can help them, because we want to train people as scientists. We want to help them build up the data about the new accurate understanding. So that they learn, even by doing nothing, their anxiety goes away. But we also like to give them tools in their toolbox so they have options.
I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with doctors Leslie Sokol and Marci Fox. Their book, just out, The Comprehensive Clinician's Guide to Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, published by PESI. So let's talk about PTSD. How is this applicable? How is it used? How might someone who's listening to this podcast use CBT for PTSD?
Well, first of all, we really need to say CBT has been shown to be the only effective treatment in the treatment of PTSD. Medication is used to manage symptoms, but not to treat PTSD. And the reality is that there are lots of evidence-based treatments that are based on the cognitive model. How we think influences how we feel. And there are different protocols. Edna Foa's work on prolonged exposure is perhaps the most notoriety. SAMHSA approved, and she has validated how putting these principles into practice, but cognitive processing therapy, Ehlers and Clark's work using standard CBT. So we know that CBT is effective. And although in the DSM-5, we've reclassified trauma and stress-related disorders to their own category, the reality is it's really just another anxiety disorder, right? The fear is of reliving the trauma. And the fear is not only of reliving the trauma, but reliving anything associated with that trauma. So if I, put myself in any situation or with any specific person, or I feel any specific mood, it might remind me of the trauma, the thing that I am doing my best to avoid. And unfortunately, it is impossible to avoid memories of the trauma. They're going to show up. No one can stop the memories from showing up. It's just like no one can stop anxiety from showing up. It's nature's alarm. We're programmed to get anxious. Trauma memories are there. But the key is to see that memory differently. Not to ascribe meaning that is invalid. It doesn't mean you're currently in danger because you were really in danger at some other point in time. It doesn't mean something about your character because, our trauma memories are biased. And they're biased in ways that fuel guilt and shame and all these unpleasant feelings due to inaccurate attributions of what happened. So it's standard CBT. What do? We face what we're afraid of and we test our hypothesis. So we look for the illogical, distorted, biased conclusions and we correct them. So reliving the trauma memory allows us to re-script what happened and help you see that, the shame that you're giving yourself or the guilt that you're imposing on yourself or the danger that you think is still lurking may not actually still be there. But then you got to get out there and do life. Yeah. And that's the goal in all therapy. And in order to do life, you got to get over all that discomfort of facing all of those things. But, exposure becomes so much easier once the underlying fear is addressed. It's like in the panic client that's agoraphobic. Specific phobic avoidance disappears once you're not afraid of the bodily sensations. Same thing, once you're not afraid of the trauma memory, you're not afraid to go hang out with people that remind you or go to a street corner where it happened or sit in a restaurant with your back to the door. That really all becomes possible, but it's all part of the data collection process.
If we can you guys walk us through what that would look like? Like for in a case example or a case study, someone's coming in with PTSD, whether it be related to whatever, sexual assault or whatever.
So just keep in mind that the basic principles of CBT, exposure and cognitive restructuring are going to be there whichever protocol you follow. But know that each protocol is going to do it a little differently. So when you say, walk me through, know that if you were in a prolonged exposure clinic or a CPT protocol or a more Beckian general protocol, the exact way that you do it, the timing of it, whether you write down your trauma memory, whether you talk out your trauma memory, is going to be delivered differently, but the basic principles are going to be the same. So the first step, obviously, is acknowledging that your trauma memory is a problem for you. Note that not every person with a trauma history has a problem with their trauma history. There are plenty of people that face horrific, horrible things and, are able to look at it through an appropriate lens, not let it interfere with their goals and their functioning. And they, in a very naturalistic way, cope with it. And we're really training to people to learn how to do what comes naturally to some, and it's just a whole lot more challenging for others. And the reality is that the longer the duration of the trauma and the more repetitive the trauma, the more damage it's likely to do and the harder it's going to be for an individual to get beyond it on their own.
Right.
So what does it look like? So a client comes in acknowledging, that I've got PTSD. We've collaboratively agreed that you have a trauma history that is invading your life, that is torturing you, that is interfering with your functioning, and really getting in the way of the quality of life that you want to have. So we're in agreement that we're here to work on this. The first step is something that I've already mentioned to you, is you got to talk about avoidance. Before you can talk about any work with PTSD, you have to talk about avoidance, because we're going to ask them to do the scariest, most unpleasant thing that they could ever imagine. Because you don't have PTSD unless you avoid the experience, right? That's the diagnostic criteria. And you're going to ask them to do something that they have done everything in their power, maybe staying up all night to avoid those nightmares. So we're asking them to do something that in theory to them seems crazy. I spent my whole life trying to avoid these. Why would I want to look at these horrible things? And so we talk about what's the upside to not avoiding. And usually I like to find an example in their own life. Is there anything that made you uncomfortable earlier in your life that you're no longer afraid of or uncomfortable with? And, and maybe there's something that made them uncomfortable and they still are uncomfortable. And I say, well, have you ever faced that thing that you're on? No. It's interesting. You never faced it and you're still uncomfortable. Is there anything else? Well, actually, I was afraid to go in the deep end of the pool. Oh, that's interesting. Are you still afraid? No. Well, what helped you not be afraid? Well, eventually I learned to swim. Oh, so you got some resources on board. And then what? And then you went into, you learned to swim. So did you get over your fear of the deep end by avoiding ever going in a swimming pool, especially avoiding the deep end? Or did you manage to overcome your fear by facing what you were afraid of? You know what? That's what this is all about. But I'm not going to ask you to just jump in before I've given you some swimming lessons, right? I'm going to arm you with resources that say it's safe for me to do that. And so a lot of early treatment, from my perspective, is helping them really embrace this idea that I'm going to stop avoiding, because avoiding prevents my recovery. Avoiding allows the experience to grow uglier and uglier in my imagination and continues to let it get the best of me. And in fact, if you think about who are the unfortunate individuals that doing PTSD work is really challenging, and some might say impossible, but I think we're figuring out ways to do it, are people that don't have memories of the trauma or have really compromised memories of the trauma. How do you work on the memory if you don't have the memory to work on? And, so you need to keep in mind that, and interesting, the only case where that's not true is sexual assault, because most people during a sexual assault have some kind of depersonalization or derealization experience. But for other kinds of traumas, if you disassociate during a trauma, you don't have access to that trauma memory. We can't face the thing that you're afraid of. So then we start to relive that story. And, you might relive that story in one telling. You might relive that story over a number of tellings. But we don't relive the story until the person is ready to relive that story. But, when people come into our office, this has caused them so much distress and has so interfered with their life that they're ready to do the work. No one's forcing them in the door. This is not court mandated treatment. And so, but the beginning part really is to say, we're going to relive it, but we're going to relive it together. You're not alone. You've got an ally in your room. I think of myself as my client's champion. I'm there by your side. We're going to do it together. We're a team. You're not on your own. And then we start to relive the story and we find the hot spots, the spots that activate all the distress. And we see what are the cognitive interpretations of that they're making. And then we try to find the misinterpretations and correct the misinterpretations. But, the reality is if you're over aroused, if you're urinating, if you're, not able to hold, tolerate the distress, we've got to dampen it down. And we have all kinds of tools to dampen down the arousal to make it possible to relive a really painful thing. But people mostly try to avoid reliving it. So they talk in the third person, they open their eyes. That's all safety mechanisms. That's perpetuating avoidance of the memory. We can't have new learning take place unless you face it. Close your eyes, re-experience it, imagine it going on, smell it, taste it, experience it, so that we can really get beyond it. And then we start to face all those outside cues that are scaring us.
Now,
and then we reclaim our life.
When you do invite someone to kind of experienced that through exposure. Is that done through like in a titrated way?
Yes, it can be. It really depends on the patient, because we really try to individually tailor it. So you can either titrate it or work with them in the session to relive the experience in their minds, talking with you there as their teammate, helping them through. And also, you can use that person as they are now today to help them walk themselves through as more of the objective adult.
Well, but the point is that, most of the protocols are not about titrated exposure. Most of the protocols are really about doing the exposure head on. But don't forget, especially in CBT, that by really working on the avoidance, we've prepared them to face the story. So it might take a month or two till you're ready to face the story. Mm-hmm. Once you're ready to face the story, most of the time you relive the entire story from start to finish, maybe not with every single detail, but from start to finish. And the important thing, I believe, of reliving the story absolutely from start to finish is because if you leave somebody mid-story, you might leave them at the most dangerous, horrific part of the story. You got to relive the story till its conclusion. To make sure. Now, when Marci says titrate, a lot of that is about what are the details. So it might be a really quick blip, and over time it might be reliving more and more and more of the details of the story. But in my personal practice, I can say that once we're ready to live the story, we're living it full throttle all the way.
Intense.
It is intense.
I mean, there's no two ways about it, right? That's pretty intense. So for people who are listening to this podcast right now, thinking to themselves, how is CBT different than other modalities or interventions or protocols in a sense? What would you say to that?
I'll let Marci take that.
We train people to be their own therapists. So we really train people. We work together as a team, and we train people how to think about their thinking, identify it, check it out. We also work on helping them to modify ineffective behaviors so that they can take more effective actions on their own behalf. And all of that helps to improve how they're doing emotionally and improve how they're doing interpersonally.
But are you asking how does cognitive behavioral therapies, all of those that fall under the umbrella DBT and CBT and PE, compare to other modalities like psychoanalytic treatment, like pharmacotherapy? So is that what you're asking? Yeah,
also that too. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So, first of all, Marci and I are experts in CBT. I'm really not an expert in anything else, and really don't have a lot of training in anything else. So it's really hard to compare how does CBT work compared to a modality that I really have no expertise in. Right. But, pretty much all evidence-based treatments that are based on the cognitive model are based on the same basic principles. It's how those principles are delivered. It's the specific interventions or the focus. Beckian CBTers, like we are, say, listen, the most important point of intervention is at the cognitive level. There are others out there that think that cognitive sort of identifying, evaluating, and modifying perceptions is maybe not necessarily where things need to focus. Maybe acceptance, just allowing the thought to arise, looking at it from a non-judgmental perspective and letting it disappear. But it's really interesting. Decentering, which has been shown, Zindel-Siegel's research, to be the most effective thing in preventing reoccurring depression. What happens in decentering is actually you learn that you don't have to be afraid or you don't have to buy into the negatively biased thoughts. So even decentering is a cognitive process.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of how we differentiate, I would still personally argue that the power is in cognitive change. The situation-specific distress is alleviated by the cognitive change in specific situations. But if you want to stay, strong and reaching your goals and not having situations unwind you and upset you, then at a deeper level, you got to look at the insecurity that drove you to see a specific situation in a distorted or biased way. And if you want to walk around seeing the world neutral, so you can just cope with it effectively, then you have to have a good, solid base of self-confidence.
Right. I love it. I mean, like I said before, when I was reading through the book, I found it very, again, not only user-friendly, but empowering. I think you provide here a lot of tools for therapists to use in a variety of situations. And also, I mean, we haven't even talked about the self-awareness that's required, or the level of awareness that's required for you to do this work, for you as therapists to do this work. Briefly talk about that before we kind of close out here.
Well, I want to say that I practice what I preach. I live CBT. I live CBT with my children. We talk about what are their goals. I use a lot of guided discovery, though my youngest son especially will tell me that I really am not doing guided discovery because I ask questions in such a way that it's always completely clear what the conclusion is that I'm trying to help everybody make. So I would say I do a lot of directed guided discovery because based on the data, it's often crystal clear what decision makes the most sense. But, even in my own life, I really do put these principles to practice. When I think about something that is sort of unraveling in my life, like writing this book, which let me compromise my yoga time and my spin time and my road biking time because it became a priority. And unfortunately, when the book was finished, it got hard to get back on the bandwagon of making those other things a priority. And I put these basic principles into practice. I set a goal that, wellness is going to be important and it's really disappearing from the equation. And I reminded myself of why I wanted to be well, because I want to live a long time and hopefully one day meet some grandchildren. And, and I said, I'm not going to feel like doing something I haven't felt like doing in months. I'm going to put action before motivation and get to it. And then I made a plan. I made a plan because I actually went on the computer and registered for a class, which means I lose the money if I don't show up. And then I didn't schedule a client at that time because I paid for a class. And I went, and here I am 2 months later, back on track.
Nice.
So we both live it, because if we're walking around and there's a shift in our mood or a shift in our body, we say, what's going through our mind? And we're able to check it out so that our emotions don't run away from us. And for us, it's also about recognizing that it's so important to put a plan in place so that you're not waiting to want to. We always joke around that Nike got it right when they say, just do it. And so we schedule realistic goals. And I do it with my family. I do it with my kids. When my kids come home, I say, okay, what's your plan today? How are you going to get each aspect taken care of? Whether it's exercise or getting their work done or meeting up with friends, it's looking at that overall plan. If they have a tough day, you say, what was the specific situation and what went through your mind? And then you get them checking everything out so that we really use the skills of thinking about our thinking. And also, I think sometimes being aware of when we're not being effective in the actions we take and holding ourselves accountable.
Awesome. I want to thank both of you. Again, the book is The Comprehensive Clinician's Guide to Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, published by PESI. They're offering Trauma Therapist podcast listeners a 20% discount by using the discount code TTP20. This will be linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Leslie and Marci, you guys are on fire. My God, I love talking to you, and I'm excited to get this out there. I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
PESI and my guests today, Drs. Leslie Sokol and Marci G. Fox, offering Trauma Therapist podcast listeners 20% off Leslie and Marci's new book, The Comprehensive Clinician's Guide to Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. This book is written for mental health professionals with all levels of experience, students, trainers, supervisors, teachers, brimming with practical and easy to understand tools to help you put CBT theory into practice. The book's filled with worksheets, coping cards, step-by-step plans, and activities that make it really accessible to help you teach your clients effective coping skills, which builds their confidence and eliminates self-doubt, which is the most crucial part of treatment. I can tell you that in preparation for this interview, I went through the book and read a lot of these worksheets and step-by-step plans as from the client's point of view, having experienced trauma myself. And I can tell you these worksheets were really empowering for me. And I'm sure if you're looking to work with individuals and especially work with trauma, this workbook is going to be invaluable. So head on over to PESI.com/CBT guide. That's PESI.com/CBT guide and use the discount code TTP20. That's TTP20. All right.